United States, the land of the free, is particularly rich in museums. And that's appropriate, because museums are a means to freedom. Here we can move out of our own personal anxieties and disappointments into the vast and stable world of human creativity. So I've come to America to see just 6 of her many great museums, to delight in the most beautiful objects from all cultures and all centuries that men and women have fashioned. And now I'm in Texas to visit the Kimbell Art Museum, a work of art in its own right.
Funding for this program was provided by the annual financial contributions to your PBS stations from viewers like you. Thank you.
Fort Worth is the end of the old Chisholm Trail. It's been called the beginning of the West. Who could guess what this modern Texan town, with its interchanges and gleaming buildings, hides in its cultural district? A museum which is in itself an American masterpiece, the Kimbell Art Museum. The enthusiasm that Kimbell generates springs from the perfection of its architecture. Louis Kahn has created that rarity, a building as great in quality as the art within it, not because it eclipses its contents, but because it enhances them so sensitively. The best praise I can give this building, so simple and austere, so warm yet reticent, is that one does not notice it. What one does notice is the air, space, and sense of beautiful objects superbly at ease. Sometimes in a museum, you're surprised when you come out to find that it's raining or it's turned very hot, because inside the museum you were completely insulated from the weather. Well, that never happens at the Kimbell. Not only are the vaults receptive of natural light, but you've got these courtyards. And here in the North Courtyard, right from early days, they decided it would hold fittingly Mayo's great sculpture, The Air. It was bought in 1967 when the Kimbell wasn't the Kimbell. It was just a dream for the founding director, Richard Brown, and Louis Kahn, the architect. And Louis Kahn actually has vine trestles over this court, as if to hold air down so that you won't float away. The first air was stone that was commissioned by the French city of Toulouse, where airmen had trained in the First World War, and that was to commemorate those who had died. But Mayo wanted bronze. He liked the gleam of it. He liked the tensile strength of it, and air does gleam out at us all through the museum. It gives us a wonderful sensation of freedom. And I think it's because we know that position. It's what we feel when we're floating in water. She's divine, so she can feel it in all elements. He's taken the classic dignity and grace of Greek sculpture into the 20th century with our sleekness and our simplicity. And there she sprawls, pushing back the clouds, unaware of us, majestic in her isolation. For me, The Kimbell is perhaps the perfect museum. One of its advantages is that it is small. Where other museums count their collections in tens or even hundreds of thousands, the Kimbell houses just over 300 works. Moreover, it will never expand. The guiding principle has been to create an ideal setting for an ideal assembly of great art. As new and finer art becomes available, lesser objects are sold, refining rather than enlarging the collection. One of the wonderful things about a museum is how you're jolted into confronting art from strange and wonderful civilizations. And you look and you learn and you expand your horizons. But sometimes, some rare and special times, the opposite happens. And you come across a work that's so beautiful that there are no barriers. Think of Michelangelo's Pieta and the head of the Madonna. Just as human beings, there isn't anyone in the world who wouldn't respond to that. And I would put this work on that level. The head of a king from Ife in southwest Nigeria, 12th, 13th, 14th century. It's so supremely beautiful that it transcends all boundaries. Of course, you can learn something about it. This head was a terracotta head, joined to a body that was perhaps wood material, and when the king died, it was buried in a grove under a giant tree. And then once a year, it would be resurrected and honored. The interesting thing is, although it's a portrait head, the very few others that they've excavated all have the same look of interior serenity. What distinguishes one from another is the crown. This four-square crown is unique to this king, and I think perhaps that was the portrait part. The crown said who he was, this particular man, but the face said what he was. He was the divine king. He was the unifier of his people. He was a focus for their aspirations. One of my limitations is that I am not interested in how a thing's made. What draws me is what's been made and what it means. So it's ironic, and it probably serves me right, that the painter I love most in the world and think the greatest, Cézanne, is great precisely because of the way he paints. Well, I have an escape clause because it's not just style, those short, choppy, parallel strokes you see up in the sky there. It's something much more profound. What he's painted is Maison Maria with a view of the Chateau Noir. And behind the Chateau Noir, you can see Mont Saint-Victoire. And since he kept his painting utensils in the Chateau Noir, he went along this road every morning. And one day decided not to go any further, but to paint what he saw. But you see, that's where Cézanne becomes so special. Because what he saw was not something out there, nor was it something in here. He had a unique understanding of the relationship between the artist and the motif, the symbiosis, the fact that all of us are on a rolling ball in space, and space and time interrelate. And that as he looked at this motif, it would change because the light would change and the air would change. The artist would move, and also the artist's eye would see things very simply without all the detail. You can see where Picasso and the Cubists are coming from. And color, too. The eye doesn't pick up great specific colors, but almost a tonal range and a blur. You can see the wonderful yellow he's caught up there on the wall of the Maison Maria, and these glorious sort of smudge of rocks and foliage that he sees out of the corner of his eye. You can see where Matisse is coming from. It's to be utterly true to the one image he's going to put on the canvas and the changes that must occur as he looks at it that makes Cézanne so great. And it's not just with landscape. Here we have his portrait of a man in a blue smock. Now this is an especially great Cézanne. It gives me great pleasure to think that the museum bought this as a tribute to the man who actually planned the whole museum, the first director, Robert Brown. What makes this Cézanne so great, so unusual, in that behind the laborer who came from his father's estates, he has put the first picture he ever painted when he was 19. How wishy-washy, how ineffective he is at 19. The girl floats there without a body, without a reality. But 40 years later, the old Cézanne has learnt, just as this workman has lived 40 years into the shape he is now, solid as a stone, so Cézanne has learnt what art demands of him. He's understood colour, the wonderful browns, the sort of red brown of the hat and the gold tan brown of his face and the rather greyish brown of his vest, and the unmistakable mark that any eye would pick up, the red necktie, and then those heavenly, indeterminate, loose blues, contrasting so with the empty blues of his youth. Again, he's not interested in a portrait. It's this encounter, what we feel when we meet somebody and get the indeterminate solidity, as it were, when we feel their body opposite ours. He looked at this man for hours, all sorts of changes. How was he to be true to what he saw and what had to stay forever on the canvas? Cézanne was convinced to the end that he failed. But if he failed, it's the most magnificent failure in art history. It's a mysterious thing to be a human being. We can control so little and we understand so little. Of our own, the only absolute certainties we have is that we were born and we will die. And in the Hindu religion, this is expressed by the two great gods, Vishnu, the benevolent, the creator, and Shiva, the terrible, the destroyer. They're opposites, life and death, creation, destruction, light, darkness. And by some amazing feat of the religious imagination, these two opposites were brought together into one great deity, Hari Hara. Here, Vishnu and Shiva blend into one. You can see it in that great head. On his left is the smooth headgear of Vishnu, and on the right, the tangled, matted patterns that suggest the curls of Shiva. Then Shiva has a third eye in his forehead, and half that eye is there. And there would have been 4 arms holding emblems to make it even clearer. And when you see that mutilation, don't you tremble at how fragile our hold is on great art. All could have been lost. But of course, thankfully, it isn't. There's enough to show what some great unknown genius did in making this figure. Not just blending together the two deities, but blending together the height of what it means to be man and what it means to be God. Because this is almost a naturalistic figure. Those eyebrows, those moustaches, that clear, strong look of the man, and the body. It's the perfect athlete's body at maturity, with the muscles rippling under the silky skin and that great sense of strength and power. And very simply clothed, just with the dhoti and the chain, which is probably gold to show this is a divinity. This is full human man who, in his strength and massive aloofness, the almost menacing look, tells his worshippers about God, Hari Hara, who by his presence demands from the Hindus obedience. Many of the works in the Kimbell are serene and still, like the museum itself. This painting of a country road by a house by Goffredo Valls, small and exquisite, is hardly a landscape at all. It's a nowhere place, empty and silent. The Dutch artist Van Redem specialized in painting the sparsely decorated Protestant churches of 17th century Holland. The plague was raging. Everyday bodies were being buried in the church. But he gives us an austere vision of beautiful lines and of space. "300 years later, another Dutchman achieves the same austerity, but how differently. When you look at this work, so simple, so radical, which Mondrian just called composition number 8. And then you look at its dates and realize it took him 3 years to paint it. You may well ask yourself, what was he doing? Well, part of what he was doing was escaping from the Nazis.
He came from his native Holland to England, to London, and started this in 1939. Then the bombs came, and he left again for New York, where he finished it in 1942, 2 years before he died. But when he wasn't escaping, he would have been pondering, because everything Mondrian painted came from what he called an inner necessity, and that was a necessity to show you the nature of the world, its purity, its essential rightness. Now, this may seem rather odd at a time when the insanity of war was raging, but that made it all the more urgent. He stripped himself down to 3 colors, the primary colors, red, yellow, blue, God's colors, none of man's mixtures, and the 2 non-colors, black and white. And he would use the white as the background, and then there would be verticals of black. There are 5 here from edge to edge, and horizontals of black, also 5 here, though 2 don't reach the edge. And you would be presented with a rectangle of right angles. And he used right there in a moral sense. This was the essence of the world. To use a diagonal made him feel faint with horror. Now, he wasn't always like that. 25 years ago, when he painted Facade, composition number 7, looking at a Parisian street, he could use diagonals, he could use curves, he could use other colors. But then he became more and more possessed by this idea of the radical simplicity and purity of life. And so we get a work like this. Now, it can sound dull. In fact, the eye follows it with interest that never wanes. Partly, this is because when you look at it, you can see Mondrian's hand, how he thickens the blacks and smooths out his reds. But also it's because he has meditated so profoundly on getting the balance right, that spiritual balance. If you're a Mondrian follower, you could tell right away that this is one of his American pictures that were later to produce 2 boogie-woogie pictures. People thought Mondrian would hate New York, that rigid Puritan, but he loved it. He loved the excitement of it, the exhilaration. He loved the way the streets made grids and the traffic lights. And so he began to make much smaller rectangles. And here, for the first time, this daring note, he actually has a red on top of a yellow. He's beginning to see that his idea of the perfection of the world, though is absolutely true, has to loosen up a bit. Now remember, this is not just Mondrian painting a picture. This is Mondrian trying to share with us a vision of transcendent beauty.
The Kimbell's piece is a reservoir of calm for the lucky people of Fort Worth, who live in the real world of business and bustle. It is perhaps why I respond to it so strongly. My real world is a world away from bustle, and coming out into a world of travel and television is the unreal part, where sometimes I get glimpses of what I've left behind.
When the Japanese want to divide up the interior space of their house, they don't build a great heavy wall. They bring in a movable screen, which has the added advantage of having a picture on it. Now, the minute I saw this screen, this 17th century screen, I was attracted immediately. And I've got to be truthful with you, it was for a very personal reason. But after all, we all bring to a museum who we are. And what I am back home is somebody who lives in solitude, in a trailer, in a little wood in the monastery grounds with my hazelnut trees and my syringa trees. And you can imagine how I bonded at once with the emperor and felt very envious of him too, because there he was, not exactly in his trailer, but still alone. He's got cherry trees round him. He's got the things he loves, his musical instruments and his books. And he's wearing the imperial equivalent of a habit. There he is, sedate, lost in prayer. The little bridge goes nowhere. He's far away from the wild, thin waves of the sea, the active life where things happen. There are people there. There are two little boats. And trudging along the seashore is a faithful retainer. And you see, in my fantasy, I imagine he's bringing the emperor his daily provisions, his skimmed milk and his vegetables and his 2 pieces of crisp bread. And then, of course, I read the title, which was The Exiled Emperor on Okinoshima. And I realized at once that no, he's not in solitude, which is something chosen and loved. He's in exile, he's lonely. And that look of composure is put on because he's waiting desperately to be rescued. And rescue is at hand. His faithful retainer has come to take him in a boat away from solitude, back to the hubbub. Now, it remains a wonderful piece, but I still can't help wanting to tell the emperor, oh, you foolish man, stay in solitude, don't lose it all for the excitements of the court.
The big city, with its enticing promise of fame and fortune, has also been a lure to artists down the centuries. When Caravaggio painted the card sharpers, it was at the end of the 16th century, and he was a very young man from the provinces, scrabbling to keep his head above water in Rome, not succeeding. This painting made his name, because it was bought by Cardinal Del Monte, one of the great movers and shakers of the art world, and he became a lifelong patron. The cardinal, who I'm sorry to tell you was a bit of a gambler himself, was smitten by the originality of this work. And perhaps I'm maligning him when I say, I wonder, did he see fully how original it was? At first, we just notice the opposition between the two young men, the good boy and the bad boy. The good boy is soft and pretty, look at those perfect eyebrows, and well cared for, in his expensively understated garment with that ladylike little lace collar and cuffs. The bad boy has struggled to learn how a man about town dresses. He's got his dagger, drawing our attention to those glorious gleaming stripes on his breeches, and that most beautiful feather, making us aware of how modish his hat is. Now, I see another opposition here too. On the left, there's the astonishing realism of that backgammon set, utterly convincing. And there in the center is the unconvincing villainy, the stagey presence of the major villain, the card sharper supreme. Everything about him is oozing the fact that he's up to no good. Even to his gloves.
He's wearing the gloves with the cut-out fingers of a professional card shop so he can feel the marked cards. Here he doesn't have to because he's signalling in an extremely obvious way so that his junior partner can bring out the hidden, secret winner. Now, I think Caravaggio is showing us in the great villain what we think of as an evildoer. Somebody stagey and looking the part, whereas the young villain is what it really is like to be an evildoer, young and frightened and tense, driven to it. Look at that boy. How rigid he is with fear as he embarks upon this thing that he does not want to do, but needs to get the money. I can't help feeling that Caravaggio had very little sympathy for the pampered boy, who should have had more sense anyhow. But he also doesn't warm to the great big bully of a villain. But his sympathies are very much with the novice cheat. He's like a wiry little puppy facing the charming Tom Kitten at the other side. Caravaggio, who is a bad boy himself, knows what this poor beginner bad boy is feeling. His sympathy goes out, and mine does too. It's 35 years on, and another artist, Georges de la Tour, is remembering Caravaggio's card shop and how successful it was. Now, he's far from the center, far from Rome, far from Parisian France. He's in Lorraine. And it could be that he paints his version, the cheat with the ace of clubs, in an attempt to appeal to a more sophisticated clientele. Now, with this picture, what you have to watch are the eyes. The dupe, who's so extravagantly dressed with such pictorial glory that you feel he's come into a fortune and is nearly all on his back, is looking down and inwards at his cards, at himself. He is as smug as can be, pleased with himself. Oh my. If anyone deserved a fall, this young lad does. And then you have the central lady, the madam, with that almost alarmingly perfect oval of her face. Again, overdressed with a very snazzy hat and well aware of her splendor, down to the corsets that are cutting into that rather unappealing expanse of bosom. Now, she's making a double signal. With her hands, she's alerting the cheat, but her eyes are swiveled towards the junior courtesan, the maid, so delightful in her embroidered blouse, and so distressing in her complicity. There's nothing, I think, more affecting in art than the look on that pretty little face as her eyes dart across to the youth, to know when is the moment when she's to produce the wine and cause a distraction. And then the cheat himself, shabbily dressed, though he's made an attempt with all those bows, but he hasn't even got a hat, poor lamb. He looks out at us. This is an experienced cheat. He just wants to be certain that nobody's looking at him. I can't help thinking, with his red hair and furtive expression, that here we have a fox and a goose, as compared to Caravaggio's cat and dog. But with Caravaggio's youths, I feel there's hope for them. They might grow up to something, but everybody here seems caught in a trap of pettiness. They're all mean-minded. And I always marvel at the mastery of the painting and the civility of those who are painted. This is a wonderful, unforgettable work. And I'm sorry, but I do not like it.
Don't go to an art gallery expecting to like everything. Artworks are like people. We respond to them differently according to our own characters. They're famous artists who move other people deeply, but who usually leave me cold. One of the features of the Kimbell is that they have such fine examples in their collection that I found myself drawn to artists I might normally shy away from.
It sometimes baffles me as to why I love romantic music, Beethoven, Schubert, and romantic poetry, dear Keats. And yet, I sometimes have a difficulty with romantic painting. Too often I feel that the artist wants to push me and get a response that he has decided beforehand. Now, the great German romantic, of course, was Caspar David Friedrich. And what makes it worse in his case is that he always had the noblest intentions. He was a profoundly religious man, and he was living at a time, first half of the 19th century, where images of religion, crucifixions, Madonnas, didn't work. And he thought of using natural images, but in a symbolic way. They would bear a religious charge. Now, that's what he's done here. It's a mountain with floating clouds. And you can see there are two worlds here. There's a distinction. There's that far distant, remote mountain with its shining clouds. And then, in our face, as it were, the brown, earthy scene of the woodland. At the back, there are the tall, young trees. And then there are the middle-aged, battered trees, with whom I feel a lot of sympathy. And then in the front, there's the dead tree. Now, the symbolism is obvious. The world where things don't last and the world where things do last. Time, eternity, earth and heaven. Now, perhaps because this picture is very small, or perhaps because Friedrich was nearing the end of his own life and he was painting with great conviction, for once I can say truthfully, I love it. Centuries ago, perhaps even a millennium ago, we don't know when and we don't know why, the devout Buddhists of a remote, forgotten little kingdom up on the northeast border of Thailand decided that they needed to hide all their sacred images. And they wrapped them in cloths and they laid them in the basement of their temple. And they never came back. And time passed and all was forgotten and there was just a small village and a dilapidated temple. Then in 1964 there was a terrific storm and the great flooding waters revealed what had been hidden. A few Buddha, many Bodhisattva images, of which, and this will not surprise you, the Kimbell has one of the most beautiful. A Bodhisattva is a saint who's passed through the 10 degrees of perfection and reached enlightenment and is poised to enter into nirvana, total bliss, and become a Buddha. but he stays there at the threshold so that he can comfort and help us. Now, of all the Bodhisattvas, the most loved was Maitreya, who takes his name from his great capacity for Maitri, that almost untranslatable word which means love and tenderness and friendliness and going out to people and trusting them, that total acceptance that we all long for and mostly don't find. And because the world is clearly not what it should be, it's an aggressive, unloving world, the belief grew up that this world would pass away. There'd be a new world, a world of love. And that Buddha, the Buddha of the future, would be Maitreya. So in the present, he's a bodhisattva, but he always suggests that future. And in the 7th or 8th century, this was how these Buddhists saw him, a wandering monk who possessed nothing and wanted nothing. 2 pairs of hands, because one must stretch out to us to welcome us and to teach us, and the other pair are raised in exaltation and expectation of that world to come. Every part of this exquisite saint reminds us of what a Christian mystic has said: all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. The look on the bodhisattva's face and the poetry of the body, like a fountain, like a young tree, all speaks of the lyricism of that supportive hope. And now, though this is hard to believe, here is a completely different concept of the same bodhisattva. This is no wandering monk, this is a prince. This figure comes from the 1st or 2nd century from northeast Pakistan, Gandhara. And Gandhara is one of those extraordinary art forms in which that East and West, never the twain shall meet, is disproved. These people had seen Hellenic sculpture. They knew what the great Greek gods looked like. And although this is not a great Greek god, if you look at the profile, that's pure Apollo, with the flowing hair and the moustache and all the jewelry and princely attire of a great Gandharan nobleman. In fact, this could be a portrait of a king, except that it stands in a temple and it has that inward look, one who knows that there is a world to come, and in it we will find perfect peace.
Sadly, we still have to deal with an imperfect world. A world where the truth is seldom pure and never simple. And the collection, too, has many works dealing with this world of realpolitik, though not all as frightening as the giant Miro, which threatens us at the entrance.
Life is unfair, as we know. And so, though we know a lot about the Renaissance artists of Florence and Siena and Venice, Ferrara has been rather forgotten. And yet the Duke of Este had grand artists at his court, and they had a distinctive style with a hard, wiry line and great psychological insight. His Duchess, Eleonora of Aragon, had as her family motto, death before dishonor. And she asked the court artist, De Roberti, to paint some pictures of ladies who exemplified this for her private apartments. Well, this is De Roberti's Portia and her husband Brutus, that famous Brutus, who was a close friend of Julius Caesar, and who decided, after a great deal of deliberation, that it was his duty to assassinate him because he was destroying the country. But you can see from that heavy, grumpy, melancholy face, this was not a man who made decisions easily. So Portia had to live through all his jumping up in the nights and crying and moaning around, and she couldn't get the secret from him. The reason will really make you laugh. It was because the Romans had this ludicrous idea that a woman couldn't keep a secret. So Portia decided to teach him. She gashed herself. Now, she really gashed herself on her thigh, but because Eleonora was a woman of such intense modesty, Roberti thought he'd better play it safe, so she's gashed herself on her foot. But this rather destroys the point of the story, which was that Portia didn't tell anybody. It was only when she was almost dying of blood poisoning that she told her husband what she'd done, which of course convinced him at once that here was a woman who could be trusted with anything. Now, it's an extraordinary picture. Portia is as plump as a partridge, so pretty, so alert, so sleek, so tight little figure, full of energy and self-control. And Brutus, that squat, saturnine husband of hers, almost a caricature. And I think that De Roberti felt that this death before dishonor motto was a bit out of date for the end of the 15th century, which for them, of course, was modern times. And I think he subtly undercuts the melodramatics of it by concentrating instead on the fascinating dynamics of a marriage.
Portia is an ideal woman, a model of courage, but an ideal that perhaps the bravest of us feel she can live up to. Not me. But who could measure up to the perfection of Canova's idealized head of a woman?
People can be slow to warm up to Canova. Ours is an age that likes warmth, passion, movement, the gritty. In fact, the most popular art form is film. What we don't like is perfection. And of course, Canova was the great neoclassical sculptor, and perfection was what he was after. Perfectly polished marble, cool, gleaming figures, gracious and elegant, far removed from the hurly-burly. Just what you've got in this ideal head. The flawless features, the astonishing profusion of those curls, those ringlets, cascading down with such exactitude, such control, and yet so springy. Now, Canova was a very nice man, and he made 4 ideal heads for his 4 benefactors. And this is the one he made for Charles Long, the financier. Long was enthralled by it. He wrote saying he was passionately in love with her. He'd never seen anything so beautiful. Well, I wouldn't go quite as far as that. There's a sort of icy regularity to those features. But it is an extraordinary work of art.
Ironically, the very smallness of the Kimbell's collection has made it even more painful to choose what to share with you. At every step, I'm reminded of what has been missed. I very much wish there could have been time for this exquisite Fra Angelico. It was originally one of the small paintings under an altarpiece, but it is wholly complete in itself. No time either for Manjushri, this little Buddhist saint boldly astride his lion, or the wonderful Han dynasty dog so bravely guarding the eastern treasures. Outside the museum, there are works that echo the strength and purity of the architecture. Henry Moore's Figure in a Shelter, or the strangely haunting shapes of a garden by the contemporary Japanese sculptor Noguchi. The work which for me sums up the Kimbell, this modern minimal masterpiece, is also Japanese, but it's smaller and much, much older.
Sometimes when I see a piece of lacquer work, I have the sinking feeling that the selling point, artistically speaking, is that the stuff is so hideously difficult to work with. The lacquer only grows in remote parts of Asia. It produces very little sap and it's poisonous. So that on your base wood or whatever, you put the merest film. And then you have to wait nearly 2 days for it to dry before you can put another film. But with this piece, this Saki vessel from the 17th century, the word that comes to mind is not difficulty, but perfection. It seems to me as nearly perfect as humanity can manage. And what makes it even more fascinating is that this was a vessel for use. It's called Nogoro work, and it comes from the name of a long-lost monastery where the monks crafted robust pieces of equipment to use in their daily lives and their ritual, rather like the Shakers and their furniture. But what an eye, the man who first worked out this shape. The way he's got that narrow little spout at the top and then the great swelling rotundity that swoops down to the feet. It's impossible to say why that is so wholly satisfying. And the color too. There would have been about 10 layers of black lacquer and then 10 of red, but over the centuries, the red has been rubbed off. And of course, for the Chinese, that would have been an impairment. They like things pristine. For the Japanese, it's an enhancement. And for us too, because there isn't just a sameness. It glows with different intensities, where it's now red and now black. And when I look at this, I can't help feeling that it's emblematic of the architecture of the Kimbell. It's so elegant. It's so gloriously graceful, and yet so sublimely utilitarian.
Take a closer look at the works of art and museums featured in the program at www.pbs.org. The Sister Wendy's American Collection 6-video boxed set and the companion book are available from WGBH Boston Video. To place an order, please call 1-800-255-9424. Funding for this program was provided by the annual financial contributions to your PBS stations from viewers like you. Thank you.
This is PBS.